As we move into the late Archaic and Classical periods, we are still quite a while off from democracy in Athens here. Instead, we first encounter the reigns of the Athenian tyrants. Now, I do need to reframe things a little bit here before we get started. While the modern English word tyrant generally denotes oppressive regimes or kind of autocratic rulers, initially, during the Archaic and Early Classical period, tyrant wasn't a negative quality or really a descriptor. It simply referred to the consolidation of power in a single individual or leader. It wasn't until the advent of democracy in the wake of the early 6th century riots that overthrew many of the governments that tyranny became more heavily demonized and took on the definition that we use today. Tyrants are not exactly kings, at least in the conventional sense as we understand it. Their acquisition of power and eventual use of it is markedly different from what we might think of as a traditional monarchy. Many of the early tyrants were not born into power, but they acquired it through rhetoric and building relationships with wider people, and gaining the support of different factions of a deme, a population group. In this sense of the word, a tyrant is simply anyone, good or bad, who obtained and executed power in a polis by unconventional means. Their support could come from fellow oligarchs, or from the middle class, or even from peasants who had no land or were in debt to wealthy landowners. Alongside the deme, the regular people of the city, there was an aristocracy of wealthy citizens in Athens, which increasingly became highly competitive cultural-wise, especially with the advent of zoned policies. An argument could even be made that the tyrants were initially broadening power dynamics by involving more members of the urban population, so that decision-making didn't rely purely on that aristocratic network alone. Naturally, as a ruler, one of the best ways to get people on your side is to engage in projects that directly benefit them. And we see this exemplified pretty well in the late Archaic period through extensive civic architectural projects in urban centres. In the early 6th century in Samos, for example, we find evidence of the tyrant Polycrates constructing numerous infrastructure projects. Under his rule, the Samos natives developed an engineering and technological expertise to a level that was unusual even in ancient Greece. In the midst of his account of Polycrates, Herodotus notes 3 engineering works. The first was an aqueduct in the form of a tunnel that he says was around 1,036 metres long, which actually can still be seen and was known as the Tunnel of Iopalinos. Polycrates was also supposedly sponsoring the construction of a large temple of Hera, which was one of the 3 largest temples in the Greek world at that time. He also appears to have upgraded the harbour in his capital city, ordering the construction of a deep water mole, nearly 1/4 mile long, which is still used to shelter Greek fishing boats today. Archaeological work in Samos has called Herodotus into question, though, as the Temple of Hera was clearly already well underway before Polycrates took to office. Moving back to Athens, though, I covered a lot of the features of the city in the last episode, so if you haven't seen that, go check that out first. Importantly, alongside the Agora, I'll give you the sort of Cliff Notes version, and the Acropolis, the Panathenaic Way served as the central street that crossed through the entire city. While it was appropriated for religious and festive use at times like the Eleusinian mystery processions or the Panathenaic Games, its usual everyday purpose was mostly commercial and civic. It hosted avenues of shops and meeting places and service brokers. As well as its physical use, though, connecting districts and neighbourhoods of the city, the Panathenaic Way also served to create ideological links between aspects of power in Athens. The road served primarily to connect the Acropolis with the Agora, in such a way that nearly everyone who came to Athens would have to pass through it. A space like this is therefore pivotal to the Athenian identity, and it was considered prime real estate for rulers to work on and build their influence in. The Agora, most of all, was ideological, public, and the administrative heart of the city, and it's been excavated since the 1920s, mainly by American universities. When we look at a plan of the Agora, it's easy to view it all through a reductionist lens and assume that everything on this screen was always here. In reality, a lot of the more famous places that we know today, such as the Odeon, the Temple of Ares, and the Stoa of Attalos, are not actually classical. They're Hellenistic or Roman era constructions. The Stoa of Attalos, for example, has very little, if anything, to do with classical Athens, while the Odeon is mostly Roman in origin. Since the Agora was so important and popular, it never stayed in the same state or layout for very long. It changed between generations very quickly. It's therefore very important to know what was there in each period to understand how each generation and culture used it and thought about it. Since the construction of buildings is usually much later, the earliest evidence coming out of the Agora from the 7th century is wells or deposits. The extensive wells in the area indicate that it likely didn't have funerary associations and was probably originally associated with ceramic production. As we get into the 6th and 5th century, though, things evidently become much more centralized as the Athenians start to become more organized. Let's look at a reconstruction of it from the 5th century. Here, the southeastern fountain house was the earliest and most important structure because it brought fresh water into the Agora, perhaps even being the main place where people came to collect their water. Next to the fountain house was the mint, the building in which the famous Athenian drachma were minted. On the southwest side was the tholos, a circular dining room of the state deputies alongside two bolloteria, an old and a new one. The newer bolloterion was built around 425 BCE, but the old state archives would have been kept in the older one. In front of the tholos stood the Monument of Eponymous Heroes, a raised platform that would have had 10 statues of the heroes who gave their names to the 10 tribes of Athens. Under each statue, around the base, was a carving space which had the names of each of the tribe's most important citizens engraved. Also to the south was the famous Stoa Basileus, perhaps the oldest stoa in Athens. Inside were engraved the laws of the city. That building next to it is the Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios, which was probably built over the top of an archaic temple to Zeus that was destroyed by the Persians. Situated on a hill overlooking this stoa was the Hephaestion, a temple that was dedicated to Hephaestus and Athena. Just beneath it, in the carved hill, was a series of steps made for gatherings. This area was known as the Synedrion, and was probably used as a meeting place for courts or citizens. On the other side of the Stoa Basileus lay the most famous stoa of Athens, the Poikile Stoa. This was the most famous stoa for two reasons. First, it was decorated with paintings created by the most important painters, and secondly, it was the place where the philosopher Zeno of Citium used to teach around 300 BC, and in doing so founded Stoicism. Moving further round from the Tholos, we had the Aikreion, and next to it the famous South Stoa, which had up to 16 large rooms and dining rooms for the public. Lying in the eastern section of Athens were the famous law courts, as we can see here. Finally, to the north, besides the Echkara and the altar of the 12 gods, there was the so-called Periskonisma, a place that, when needed, was bound with rope, tied to wooden piles, forming a square space for public speaking and debate. Of all of these areas, the Stoa Basileus is perhaps the most misrepresented. It is occasionally called the Royal Stoa in some older pieces of literature, largely stemming from Homer's use of the word Basileus to mean royal or ruler. By the time we get to Athens, though, Basileus simply denotes someone in charge of decision-making, centrally around matters of law, not necessarily a king. While almost never mentioned, the blue sections that you can see on this plan are actually Middle Bronze Age burials, which give you an idea of how significant this place has been over the generations. Of the two Bouleuterion, the 500 representatives of Athens would likely have met in the old one to pass and discuss laws. We're not entirely sure why they built a new one, but at some point in its history, the old Bouleuterion became an archive. It could be a case of political refreshing, in that constructing a new one re-established the political power in the Agora. As we move out of Athens itself, I want to talk about the hinterland a little bit. Notably, in the south corner of Attica lay its silver mines, which constituted a large amount of wealth for Athens. The coast was equally important for connections with other polises, and the movement of things like trade goods and grain to feed the city. In all, the Athenian demes, the natural divisions or suburbs, were divided into 3 regions under Cleisthenes, the founder of democracy. These were the coast, the main city, and the inland. They were then divided into 10 groups called tritheis. Each tritis was called by the name of its chief deme. Following the Athenian riots, he then disposed of the 4 birth-based tribes and created 10 new ones composed of 1 tritis from each of the 3 regions. This was a major political move, and it ensured that central Athens was not the only one responsible for maintenance of the region, but that they could have vast connections with supporting countryside around them, with all people operating under one single identity. This was manifest in the Council of 500, which would meet regularly in the Bouleuterion, taking 50 members from each tribe to ensure everyone in the region was fairly represented. Questions still remain for us around how central Athens operated and engages with its wider hinterland, though. We have some interesting evidence in the form of fortifications at key extents or areas in hinterland like Eleusis or Rhamnus, which seem to suggest a kind of collective effort to protect the territory. But there is still a question of difference in whether their borders constitute political ones, ideological, or religious ones. Eleusis, for example, was originally separate from the boundaries of the Athenian hinterland, and they had no control of it in the early geometric period. However, this clearly changed during the classical era. The primary way in which Athens brought Eleusis under political control, thereby cementing its hegemony over the entire region of Attica, was by extending its processual way to provide a physical connection to the sanctuary. From the 5th century onwards, we see this clear political shift occurring as we watch more and more emphasis get placed on political identity in the public domain. Following the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars, public monuments became central features of the hierarchy's response to conflicts. Not only are public monuments powerful ways of cementing a collective identity or ideology, but they also serve political action very well, often justifying larger taxes and the movement of resources from the population. Towards the very end of the Archaic period, we have the infamous event of the tyrannicides, Harmodios and Aristogeion. The epic cycle will go on to become a cornerstone of Athenian mythic tradition. Along with the later assembly, both of these figures became fundamental to defining Athenian identity as a culture that stands for equal opportunity, and numerous statues were built to represent them. A tradition that was continued in the form of the statues of the eponymous heroes in the Agora. These ensured that every member of the 10 tribes were equally represented and displayed. The final part of Athens left to discuss is the Pnyx. We've seen the Acropolis and the Agora, but the Pnyx was the space in which all citizens could meet. It became crucial to making certain decisions, such as when or if to go to war. As Athens moved into the Hellenistic period, the space became more and more monumentalized and commercial to support the greater members of people, eventually even including shops and dining areas. The fact that the Pnyx had its own defined identity and necessity tells us a bit about the tensions that arose between decisions made by all the citizens and those who were invested with political power. A lot is often made about the Parthenon as a display of political power, oftentimes associated with its builder Pericles. He designed the temple not only to show the power of the state to the Athenian people themselves, but also as a marker to outsiders. Tied up in this is cultic ideology around Athena herself, the patron of the city. While people are often familiar with the monumental bronze statue of Athena Parthenos inside of the Parthenon, there was actually another second monumental statue of Athena, Promachos, sculpted by Phidias, which stood between the Propylaea and the Parthenon. Athena Promachos, as an epithet, denotes the warlike Athena, who fought on the front lines. Notably, this statue was far more publicly visible and displayed than the Athena Parthenos, signifying to Athens foreigners that Athenians first and foremost had a strong capacity for warfare. The Parthenos Virgin Athena was to be found inside the Parthenon temple and is distinctly less warrior-like, being heavily protected and behind the closed doors of the temple, flanked by the warrior aspect of the goddess, also signals potential ideological gender roles for the Greeks here, that virginity was a cherished aspect of womanhood that required protection. So what we're seeing here in Athens is a powerful state ideology beginning to be expressed through architecture in things like the Acropolis, monumental sculpture, and the Agora. If we consider Athena Parthenos as the internal statue, that is how Athenians may be viewed themselves among citizens, but Athena Promachos, the external warlike Athena, is how they wish to appear to foreigners. The question becomes, though, how true is this model of expression for other policies? And that remains to be seen, which is still a question that's fascinating other archaeologists. So as always, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode.